So in this series of lectures, we'll discuss the heart. We've already talked about blood as part of the cardiovascular system, that tissue that aids in the transport of nutrients and waste hormones throughout the body. And now we'll turn to the heart, which is the central pump of blood throughout the body. The heart participates in or pumps blood through pulmonary circulation, which involves the right ventricle, the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary semilunar valve, the pulmonary arteries that carry blood to the lungs, and the pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs, back to the heart through these pulmonary veins to the left atrium. The left ventricle pumps blood with significant force through the pulmonary semilunar valve, the aorta, the aortic arch, the systemic arteries, the systemic capillaries, which are where gas exchange and nutrient exchange occurs, and into the systemic veins that carry blood back to the heart through the inferior and superior vena cava to the right atrium. The heart also participates in coronary circulation, which is a derivative or a branch of systemic circulation that supplies the myocardium or the heart muscle and drains it. The heart is situated in the mediastinum or mediastinum, which is a cavity within the thorax. So the heart spans about the second intercostal space, the space between the ribs, to the fifth intercostal space. And being able to count those spaces is essential in the placement of EKG or ECG leads. As you can see from the picture, it's situated slightly left of the sternum, of the breastbone. It has a base at its superior end and an apex at its inferior end. And the apical area is the point of maximal intensity, the point of the greatest concentration of myocardium and thus the greatest concentration of pulse. So at this fifth intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line, you'd be able to auscultate or listen to heart sounds using a stethoscope. In this figure, you can see the multiple membranes of the heart. The endocardium, which is a simple squamous layer that lines the internal portions of the chambers. It should provide a friction-free surface for blood to glide over. Damages to the endocardium, as such, would occur with bacterial endocarditis, and inflammation and infection of the endocardium can cause clots to form in the heart itself. The myocardium, which is composed of cardiac muscle, about 1 to 2% of that cardiac muscle is autorhythmic, meaning it is able to create its own nerve signals, its own action potentials. The other 98 to 99% are contractile cells, similar to smooth and skeletal muscle. On the outside of the heart is the epicardium. Epi above, cardi means heart, or the visceral layer of the pericardium. This layer secretes serous fluid, which is a sterile water-based fluid, into the pericardial cavity. And the pericardial fluid provides protection from the heat of friction that occurs when the heart beats against its own fibrous layers and the lungs that surround it. More externally or more superficially is the parietal and fibrous pericardium, and both of those help to anchor the heart to the tissues that surround it so that as the heart is beating, it's not moving too much within the thoracic cavity. Pericarditis, inflammation of either of these pericardial membranes, produces, in some cases, excess fluid, which then compresses the heart and causes cardiac tamponade. And tamponade refers to plugging or occlusion of the heart muscle. Or, in some cases, a lack of pericardial fluid, and then you could hear a friction rub between the pericardial layers. The myocardium, or functional part of the heart, that's the heart muscle, is arranged in these circular bundles that you see. And the circular bundles are surrounded by connective tissue that helps to anchor them to each other and create a system of rhythmic pumping where the atria pump first and then the ventricles pump. And it also creates sort of a lag time or delay time between contraction of the atria and then contraction of the ventricles, so that blood isn't just spurting back and forth between the atria and the ventricles. So embedded question number 1, what is or are the differences between pulmonary, systemic, and coronary circulation? Question number 2, describe the location of the heart within the thorax. Question 3, describe the composition, that means tissue, location, and function of the endocardium, myocardium, and the 3 layers of the pericardium. Number 4, why do you need pericardial fluid? And number 5, what dangers are associated with pericarditis and cardiac tamponade? And here you see a frontal or coronal view of the heart. So let's talk about a couple of these structures before we delve into the pathway of blood through this system. The 2 atria are the upper chambers. There are 2 ventricles, the lower chambers, and notice that the left ventricle, the left myocardium, is much thicker, about 3 times thicker than the right ventricular wall. And the reason for that is that the left ventricle is pumping blood with enough force to get it through millions of miles of blood vessel through the body and up and over this aortic arch, so up and over against the force of gravity. The 2 atria are not very muscular because they don't need to be. They only need to really hold blood until it's moved by gravity and slight contraction into the ventricles. The semilunar valves are very thick valves at the base of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, and their jobs are to keep blood from leaking into the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. The atrioventricular valves, those between the atria and ventricles, are the tricuspid on the right and the bicuspid or mitral on the left. Now they're called tricuspid or bicuspid because they have cusps or leaves, 3 on the right, 2 on the left. The first sound you hear when you auscultate a heartbeat, that slightly less or loud lub, is due to closure of these AV valves. The stronger, harder sounds of the heartbeat that you'll auscultate or listen to are caused by the closure of the semilunar valves. And you can think of the valves like doors. They keep the doorways between the atria and the ventricles, or between the ventricles and the great vessels, closed until you're ready to have them open. You can also see one of the remnants of the embryonic heart, the fossa ovalis, and the fossa ovalis is a remnant of the fossa ovale, is a remnant of the connection between the 2 atria that occurs during gestation. What you can't see here is the ligamentum arteriosum, which is a remnant of the ductus arteriosus that is a hole between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And both of those remnant structures were once used to bypass the lungs of the fetus that aren't functional in a fetus who's getting its blood supply and nutrient supply through its mother and its placenta. The interventricular septum, inter meaning between, refers to that wall of myocardium between the 2 ventricles, the left and the right ventricle. The papillary muscles, so called because they look like papilla or little hills, are connected by the chorda tendineae, the heartstrings, to the atrioventricular valves. The pectinate muscles are seen in the anterior walls of the right atrium and the left auricle. The auricles are additional chambers on top of the atria, superior to the atria, that increase their collection abilities or their potential volume. Now, if those embryonic structures fail to complete their closure, we can see a ventricular septal defect in which there's still a hole between the 2 ventricles. We may hear that as a murmur, a light murmur. Coarctation of the aorta, which includes aortic stenosis or narrowing of the aorta, which means the left ventricle will have to work much harder, and the tetralogy of Fallot, tetra meaning 4. So in this case, the pulmonary trunk is stenosed or narrowed. The right ventricle has excess muscle growth or hypertrophy. There's a hole between the two ventricles, ventricular septal defect, and the aorta, which should only be receiving oxygenated blood from the left ventricle, is now receiving both deoxygenated and oxygenated blood from the two ventricles, much like we see in something like a fish, that limits the growth of that organism. And lastly, the trabeculi carni. Trabeculi are plates like we see in bone, and carni refers to muscle or meat. In the next video, we'll talk about how blood circulates through the heart and the pulmonary circulation.